and welcome. I'm Joanne Law, Director of Mediation Institute, and I'm really delighted to introduce John Cleary. I formed a collaboration with John a little while ago after actually seeing him present for International Mediation Awareness Week about his conflict management for one process that he's developed. So John will tell you a little bit more about himself and the process as he goes through, I've no doubt. But before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of Australia and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people from anywhere in the world that are joining us today. And I will hand over to you, John, and I'll we'll put you in the spotlight there.
Thanks, Joanne. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people I don't know. It reminds me there's far more mediators than I realise. You know, we all live in a little bubble of mediators, and we think that we know maybe 50, maybe 100 mediators, and then we see a whole slew of new names, including overseas names. So I mean, we'll always have new mediators popping into our vision, and I think that's wonderful. I mean, the more mediators in the world, it's got to be a good thing. So welcome to everyone. I'm going to just kind of ramble on for a little while. And I'm aware that there's people whose names I can see, but there's no indication that they're alive yet. So they might just pop into life as I'm talking. So maybe for about 5 minutes, we can kind of tolerate the fact that people are going to arrive and they haven't heard anything, and they're just going to be making themselves aware of what's going on. It's always the case when you start a session that no matter what time you make it, there'll be people who can't quite make that time. So for mediators, and can you indicate to me, please, whether you are all practicing mediators? There might be other people who are just visiting or just, but if you're because I'm talking really to you as mediators, I'm assuming that you already know a lot about mediation. So if you don't, I mean, I'm sorry. I'm trying to pitch to the mass, and so I'm speaking to you as a fellow mediator. I've had about 24 years of mediating, mainly divorce, but small workplace and a couple of strata mediations, which are very interesting, and small workplace, but mainly family. And over that time, I could see, and no doubt you can see, what happens when an ill-prepared client arrives in your mediation room. Ill-prepared, they're really not ready to change their mind. They're not ready to change their thinking about the situation they're in. They've at least agreed that they're in a conflict situation. They've at least agreed that they have there's some aspect of pain causing them to come into the meeting with you. But in every other regard, they seem positional and stiff and unsorted, and they're ready to repeat all the rhetoric about why they're the better person or why their situation is a superior one, and while the other people don't understand them. And you've heard all that so many times. And I'd heard that so many times in about, it would be nearly 10 years ago. And I thought, really, there's got to be a better way of preparing clients than an intake. An intake's a very necessary thing, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't abandon an intake at all. But surely there's got to be something better to get that client ever so gently to move somewhat in their thinking so that they arrive, the images of clients arriving in alignment about issues rather than opposed about issues. that would be ideal, and your mediation could then proceed at a beautiful pace and produce those great results that you'd like to see and that they would like to see, because they say generally that they want to see progress, that they want some forward movement in the conflictual situation that they're in. They don't want to stay where they are, that's for sure. So I built, or I innovated, this conflict management for one, which was originally called FDR, Family Dispute Resolution for one. But we'll call it conflict management for one because broadly I think that's the better label for it. And it's really based on Dr. Alan Tidwell's original work, where at Macquarie University in the 1990s, he just built a little model for disaffected university students who were at odds with each other, or at odds with the teaching staff, or at odds with, who knows, the universe. And he built a little kind of feedback loop for conflicted students who were ready to come into his office or a room and spend around about an hour, I suppose, with him. And it was a very nice loop based on tertiary educated or students who were getting their tertiary education, who were articulate, who could read, write, operate at you would expect a tertiary level. And I thought, well, I'm going to modify this because I know that separation and divorce involves all kinds of people, all different education levels and culture and ages and stages. And often that's part of the conflict that they're already in. So I modified, with Alan's agreement, I modified his little feedback loop into conflict management for one. The idea being that the mediator for the first time, not really for the first time, because you do intakes one-on-one, but for the first time as a mediator, you're meeting these people one-on-one to talk about conflict. And that, I think, is a most delightful thing to do. It's a very, very pleasant process, conflict management for one. It's not by any means a difficult one. Once you've kind of mastered the process, it's a very nice. The number of people, the number of clients that I've had who've run from the room or been critical or complained about it, absolutely none. Absolutely none. And feedback from the people that I've trained over the last 10 years, positive, and the number of complaints they've had or people who've departed, none. So on the whole, very pleasant for clients, even though they might touch on some painful issues. It's a good process for them and it's very nice for you to do. So of course I would say that, but it's true. I've had hundreds of clients and they've responded very well to having the uninterrupted interest of a mediator, and I'll call the mediator for this purpose a conflict manager, talking about the conflict that they've got before any process like mediation occurs, or maybe mediation's underway, or maybe mediation has occurred and it's been very unproductive. And so it's a nice little session. It's a once only session generally that can fit at the beginning, most often, during or after mediation. Round about 90 minutes I've found from experience, probably less than 2 hours and probably more than an hour, put it that way. And what you're doing for the first time, I'll go back to that first time, bearing in mind that you do intakes, most of you, I hope, do intakes, is have a conversation with that client based on an agenda that they create. So the very first thing is to offer them a sheet of paper, because the assumption is they've done an intake beforehand, by the way, for safety issues. safety for you, safety for them. They've done an intake process. We just assume that that's been done either by someone else or by you at a different time. So the very first thing that you do in the conflict management for one session is offer them a sheet of paper. We might just have a look at that. I'll just share it with you. And they choose how they're going to proceed. I get a message here. It sounds like I've switched to a different language. I wonder why that was the case. Spanish, they think I'm speaking Spanish in Zoom. Anyway, I'll share this. Here we are. We might just go up to this, the choices. Persevere with me as we just flick through a whole lot of slides that are part of the course, but we're not going to try and get through it all in one hour. The agenda. So it's a sheet of paper with 8 choices on it. If you want to make it 9, if you want to make it 7, that's fine. Here it is. Is the mediation the right process for me? So it's a ticker box. It's a ticker box. The other parties won't participate in mediation. Where to from here? So not uncommon for you to hear that mediation isn't even going to commence because other people are not prepared to attend at this point in time. So it could be that that's the dilemma that's bringing them to conflict management for one. Difficulties with a dispute resolution service. So often, clients have got some complaint in their mind about how things will run or how they've been dealt with or treated by a service. It might be the service that you work in. It might not be. A lot of diplomacy required there. The sessions ended unproductively, so this is where mediations occurred. What do I do now? What strategies can be found? So that's a very nice one to talk through. Without being judgmental about the mediator, you can be very interested in what happened in that mediation. I'm not ready or not able to mediate at this time, so that's the person who feels pressured. They're getting letters from the other party's lawyer or, best friend or mother or whatever, pressuring them to come to mediation. They're not ready. What can I do? Mediation's imminent. How can I maximize the opportunity? So very much a coaching question. How can I make myself more ready for the mediation? Even better, I'd like to develop some tools or strategies to work with the other party. That can be at any time, maybe after mediation. And then number 8 seems innocuous, but don't forget it. Something else. Sometimes people have something else. You can't think of everything that's happening in other people's lives. And that's an ideal opportunity for them to say there is something else. And it could be something that means they're in the wrong room. It could. But it's worth doing that at the beginning rather than discovering halfway through the session that you've got a problem. So that document with various different, colours of paper and heads and, presentations is given to the client. They tick one or more boxes. Generally, people tick one, but sometimes they tick 2, 3. Just occasionally, they tick more than that. And that begins the conversation. So the client begins the conversation very much based on their own terms. And people like that. They probably, feel somewhat directed and pushed and pulled around as they're in their conflict. And so they like that opportunity to start this particular session on their own terms. And really, you don't mind where they start because the conversation you're going to have will just vary according to the boxes they tick. And you'll be quite able to do that, particularly after you do this course. If you do this course, and I hope you do. You can see here that with that agenda, there's another column here indicating the kinds of things that you'll need to deal with those questions, bearing in mind that right throughout the session, you're speaking with all the skills and all the presence of a mediator. So you don't leave your mediator role because once you're a lawyer and you give legal advice. Absolutely not. You don't leave your mediator role because once upon a time you were a counsellor and now you're going to do counselling or some kind of therapeutic work. Absolutely not. This is designed for and addressed to mediators to stay in their role as mediators. That same thought of being aligned but unaligned. So you're in the moment with the client, but you're unaligned. You're thinking of the conflict that they've got and how you can help them manage it better. So you can see in that first question, is it right for me? The mediator needs to know about local resources, maybe alternative places if mediation is really not right for this person. What other things are available? Where are the lawyers in the area? Where are the accountants? Where are the tax advisors? Where are the counsellors and therapists and so on? So it could very well be a discussion of resources and talking about what those different processes might involve. The other party won't participate, again, resources, because maybe they're never going to mediate. You know, you can't mediate if other people won't attend. And so where to from here? So very much about the same thing, but some coaching, you know, some skills that you've got all the time when you're future focused, when you're positive, optimistic, hopeful. They're the things that you can start to introduce with a client to guide them past what they might think is a catastrophe, or reinforces their sense of victimhood, that once again they've been let down, once again people wouldn't participate in the process and so on. So very necessary for the mediator to use all those lovely skills they've already got and already use with clients, encouraging future focus, forward movement. Yep. By the way, if anyone wants to jump in and ask a question or make a comment, please feel free. I don't want you to feel like captives here in this Zoom room. Difficulties with another provider, you can see that you need to understand your process very well, so that as they explain that the mediator did this or that, their perception is that the mediator did this or that, you can gently introduce that it's a perception and be ready to normalise or comment so that they can see perhaps why a mediator did the things they did, why a dispute resolution service might have rejected them or done whatever they've done, because you have some understanding of how the industry works. So it's really kind of industry orientation, as well as an understanding of the process that you drive. The session ended productively. As I said before, you really need your diplomatic skills to make sure you don't criticise a fellow professional, but you're listening to the perception of the client as to what happened and how they were dealt with by that person. So it could well be that you need to understand the ADR process and how it varies from place to place, how it can vary, as well as having some resources for the client, as well as having those coaching skills, so that maybe their temptation toward, as I said, victimhood or feeling that they've been rejected or, you know, judged can be dealt with by, you know, your excellent skills. Sorry, did someone... No. I'm not ready to mediate. Very much coaching again, taking people past that point, maybe theoretically taking them through a mediation, explaining and illustrating, illuminating the process so they get it, And we also start to enter into the very fascinating world of conflict theory. A lot of mediators have learnt a mediation process, but they haven't spent much time with conflict theory. And in this course, I've got my favourite theorists. Hopefully you all have favourite theorists, and you can introduce clients with their permission, if they're interested or they've ticked these kinds of boxes. You can introduce conflict theory, which can be revelatory for clients. They have no idea, why should they, that all the time that they've been in conflict and well before it, human beings have been studying conflict, talking, writing, speculating, theorizing, building theories of conflict that they might find extremely helpful for them to understand why they're in the situation they're in. The same with the next one, mediation's imminent. And the same with the next one, I'd like to develop tools or strategies. You would find that that would be a very rewarding session if someone is thirsting for knowledge. You should be in a nice position to give them knowledge about what you know well, which is conflict and the conflict industry, as it's become something else, as I say, just rarely pops up and is best dealt with early if there's some reason that none of the above applies. Does anyone have any remarks or questions after that little fugue? They don't. That's nice. We can progress, and I can explain to you a little more about the process of learning conflict management for one. I think that we might go there, if that's okay with everybody. I'll do another share with you. Just move through these slides. There's a lot of case studies in the course. We're not going to touch on the case studies. There are some theorists in the course. We'll come back to those. So I'm sorry, I'm just missing the little part that I want to take you to. Here we are. So here is a session in the middle of this little diagram. Inside the blue circles, conflict management session. And you are hovering around it with a client. You can see here the coaching stream where you're coaching the client, really pulling out the positives, lots and lots of reframing, lots and lots of paraphrasing, doing some of those nice summaries that you can do, pulling them from their negative thinking around to a positive view of what they might be doing so far. After all, they've managed to find you. After all, they've managed to access your conflict management for one session. They're clearly resourceful people. So you're coaching and moving them past the kind of doubt, the bad vibes they've had maybe from a session gone wrong, the obvious negative feelings or ideas they have about the other party or parties. So a lot of intensive coaching using the skills you've already got to take people, massage people through a mediation. Up here in the pink one, you've got exploration of resources. You know what else is going on in your district, your region. You're aware of what's on the internet as far as finding information goes. Remember that clients are fairly new to this conflict, and you're very new to it too, but you've been around the block many times. So your experience can help these people. The fact that they might know about the things that are blindingly obvious to you is not a problem. You can simply take them there and reassure them this is normal, this happens, lots of people are in the same situation as yourself. Conflict theory is wonderful, the yellow one. I've got three theorists in the course, Dr. Greg Tillett, an Australian, Dr. John Burton, an Australian, and Chris Moore, an American, each approaching conflict in a different way, but with some practical applications for clients that can be most useful for them. Round here in the blue one, explaining the dispute resolution process, very often required when people feel that the process has been unfair or judgmental, or has dealt with them badly, or wasted their time, or has allowed the other client or the other people to get some advantage over them, or whatever their perception is, can be modified through explaining the process. And you've got time to do it. They're the kinds of things that you'd like to do with clients in intake, that you might like to do during a mediation, but you know you can't. This session gives you permission to have that, hour, 1.5 hours with that client, really explaining those things so that they become a different kind of client, a client who might be ready to change his or her mind. That would be very nice. A client who might be ready to entertain some other ideas about managing the conflict they've got. Finally, there's that purple arrow, that's you. So you're coming into this session very much aware that you might have to go in all those other directions, or maybe mainly one, maybe a couple. The case studies in the course are very much there to show you, based on real cases, what was required in each case. And as you can imagine, some required a lot of coaching, some required conflict theory, some had no theory in them at all. An interesting thing. It means that the session's always interesting for you, by the way. When I was talking about your coaching capacities, I'd sum it up this way, and you might mentally tick off whether you really regard yourself as having these things. Hopefully you do. You've already got them. You engender trust. You use yourself in that aligned but unaligned way, in that you're absolutely compassionate in the moment, but you're dispassionate about the case. You go home and think other thoughts. Respect, which clients plead for you. I've heard respect as something that, strangely enough, clients often haven't given the other parties, but absolutely require for themselves. Kind of a paradox there. Positive regard, you like people, you have an interest in people, an interest in how they're going to solve problems that they've got. Patience, Lawrence Gould talks about the patience required in a mediation so that you slow it down rather than speed it up. Generally, you have the patience, however long it takes. You're aware of pain, you're aware that this is a painful process. For the clients, a different kind of pain to any that you're going to experience in running the mediation or running this session. And you engender hope and enthusiasm. Hope from Lambert. I explain who Lambert is. Enthusiasm from Ernst Toll. You have the hope and enthusiasm that the clients generally lack, and they see that you do, and that can be like a drink for a thirsty person, because they see you as not another one who's going to judge them or reject them or refuse them. And why? Because you're in a one-to-one. If you're in a conventional mediation with multiple parties or two people, of course the risk is always there that something is going to happen and those parties are going to feel rather insulted or offended or dismissed or overpowered or rejected, or They're reminded of the past trauma in their relationship. All of those things can happen, but in the one-on-one with you as a mediator, it's really quite a pure discussion of conflict management if you understand the meaning of that word pure in that setting. You don't have to be distracted by the dynamics of multiple parties around the table, or even the other party around the table. Instead of being distracted into that, as is the client often generally, you can remain focused, and consequently the client can remain focused too. So I might pause for a moment because I've been talking too much, and ask for observations. Who wants to say anything about what they've heard so far?
Hey, John, you've got a question from Eli that says, who are the best theorists or suggested reading, please?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Eli. I don't know about the best theorists in the entire world, but I can tell you that the theorist who gave me confidence in building this course and gave me confidence as a mediator was Dr. Greg Tillett. So Tillett, Tillett. And the title of his book, I think, just conflict resolution. I'll reach for it. Here it is. The best way is to show, I think. So it's a practical guide to conflict resolution principles, processes, and skills. Oxford University Press. This one's the 3rd edition. I know there's a 4th edition, or I believe there's a 4th edition. Greg Tillett, unfortunately, has passed away. This 3rd edition is, what's the year there? 2007. And I think the 4th edition, therefore, would be somewhere around 2010. You would be able to buy this, I'm sure, on the net. Eli, does that answer your question? Do you want more? Does Eli want more, Rowan?
Responded with thank you.
Okay.
And I've put the link in from Amazon as well. It was 2009 that it was updated.
Good. So theory is a wonderful thing. I wonder if anyone has a view on theory in our assembled groups. Or you're keeping theory as a private delight. I think if you can introduce, even if the client begins the conversation by talking about resources, it just might be a safe way for a client, rather like when you have your interview with a doctor. Well, maybe you talk about the weather for a little bit before you go to that, that exquisite, dilemma that you've got in some part of your body. And the same with a client, they might open by a general discussion of resources or where else can I go, what else can I do. But what they're really perhaps interested in is more than that. And so the intimacy of this 90-minute session allows you to discover maybe what the subtext is, what they want to talk about underneath the ostensible subject. And it could well end up being something that has to do with theory. And there is no harm at all. In fact, it's encouraged in the conflict management session with the client's permission to introduce theory. Because if the theory's good, and Tillett's good, so's Burton, so's Chris Moore, it can apply to that person's situation and allow them to give themselves a diagnosis. How wonderful. rather than puddling about in the dark thinking, why do people hate me? Why every time I run into that work colleague, I explode with, rage or the thing that's got me into this situation that I'm in. Theory can supply some paradigms that really are revelatory, that allow that client to consider things from a different perspective. And as a mediator that once you've got clients looking at things from a different perspective, there's a great possibility of forward progress in a mediation or some other process that you're running. A great possibility. Whilst ever people are positional, at best we've got an elegant debate. And you close the mediation, you do some magnificent summaries, and people say we're no further ahead than when we began. And you think, what a shame. What a shame that we weren't able to go into some kind of mind-altering conversation so that you don't think the same way at the end of this mediation as you did at the beginning. And conflict management, for one, is a way of doing that. Ideally, if you can do it with each party who's coming into a mediation, you might even remove the need to come. You might even do that. It has happened. It's happened to me. You can feel it, that the need, the urge to have a meeting or to convene, a multi-party mediation. I'm thinking of the one that I'm thinking about. By the time we did conflict management for one with the three parties involved, it went away. Because by then they were speaking in theoretical terms. I was absolutely delighted. They were three teachers and they loved theory, as it turned out. So they sucked it up like a chocolate milkshake. But you don't have to be a teacher to benefit from conflict theory. So if you've currently got a theorist, marvellous. If you take advantage of the theorists on offer here, great. All of them are useful. Chris Moore particularly is useful because he breaks conflict into parts and people start to see if with their permission, you explain in the room what the parts of conflict might be, 6 parts, and ask them if the conflict that they've currently got fits, how it fits. You're really asking them to consult with you about this conflict and look at it from the point of view of an outsider. How marvellous if they can do it. If they can do it in your company, they might just be able to lever themselves out of the sheer mess they're in and get onto dry land, if you like that image, brush themselves off and think, wow, I can look at this conflict now. I understand, for example, it's a social conflict, or it's a structural conflict, or it's a values conflict, or it's a data conflict. Marvellous. Once people are thinking that way, they can then listen to the theorist's recommendations for what to do when you've got a data conflict, for example, or what you do when it's a values conflict. Just some ideas. And by then, they're starting to think quite differently about what they thought was just this business of, behaviour in the schoolyard, or just this business of, not the schoolyard, the staff room. Yes. So, does anyone have any questions or remarks? I feel the need to ask. Eli says, how do you build trust with the individual? But most importantly, in general, with the public. I wonder what that means. You build trust with an individual, but most importantly, in general, with the public. I'd love you to expand on that, Eli, if you could turn on your mic. I'm just not sure for mediation. I'm going to say rather lamely, in the absence of anything more, that the number of mediators who've been exposed in public and in public media as disgraceful people or as immoral people or criminally behaving people, as far as I'm aware, after nearly 28 years in practice, I'm aware of none. So mediators on the whole, unlike other professionals, have got a pretty good reputation. Unless you know more than I do, I think they generally model the kind of principled behaviour and good ethics that they'd like to see in their clients. Is that a bit weak, Eli? That sounds a bit weak to me, but that's all I can say about building trust with the public. I think you build trust with the client fairly readily, and you know that you've all got those, most of those qualities that engender trust and good relations with people. If you didn't have the qualities that engage with people pretty quickly, where they sum you up and think, yes, you're a person I can work with, you're a person who's trustworthy. If you don't have those qualities, you probably, would be doing some other kind of work. And I think we're all aware of colleagues who try mediation, that they don't like it. They're really stimulated to become judgmental, or they walk out in a huff, or they get extremely upset about issues. And they probably should be working in some other field, and they do, and that's a good thing. They move on. Eli says in the UK there's not much trust in participating in ADR in general, unfortunately. That's terrible to hear. I don't think it's the case in Australia. What do you think, Joanne, if Joanne's there? She's not there.
No, Joanne had to leave.
Joanne had to leave, but
yep.
It's disappointing to hear that not much trust in participating in ADR in general. I think in Australia, remembering in the 1990s, some of you might remember it in the room today, there was confusion in people's minds that mediation was something like meditation. They often mixed the two things together and thought because it was new and meditation was new, they were both new age kinds of things and probably interchangeable. And they were right as far as a couple of letters in the spelling of those words, but they were wrong about everything else. Mediation is distinctively different. But that settled down, I'd say, Eli, in Australia in the twos. I think if you ask people in the shopping centres, what's mediation, they'd probably be able to tell you. Whereas in the 1990s, they probably wouldn't have been able to. Yes, I can't say much except share your sense of misfortune that in the UK there's not much trust in ADR. I mentioned Chris Moore. Cheryl Didier Holstein asked, did you mention Chris Moore on American writing on conflict theory? Do I have the name right? Yes, you do. It's Chris Moore. And Chris Moore, like a lot of Americans writing in the 1970s and 80s, is a really terrific mediator. I mean, let's face it, that our mediation process as we know it, at least in Australia, but I think in the UK as well, is based on an American model. And so these guys are very practiced because they're out there mediating community mediations and multi-party mediations way before anyone in Australia did. And Chris Moore just developed a lovely practical approach, helping a client, helping you analyse a mediation. What a great start to break it into some parts so that if you arrive at the end of a conflict mediation for one session in agreement with the client that that's a third data and probably a third relationship and a third values conflict. How wonderful. You've really opened up doors for those people to then speculate, well, what do I do with the data part? What do I do with the relationship part? And Moore has got some nice practical suggestions about what you can do with that kind of conflict. A great way to break further into what's going on so that the conflict management can kind of get some change happening. And that's what we all want, don't we, in the room, is to see a change underway. I'll get the Chris Moore book if that might be helpful. I should have had it. Chris Moore.
I think his name is Christopher Moore, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So is that upside down or right way up?
It's the right way.
That's the right way. Christopher Moore, The Mediation Process. Don't worry that it's 1980s. It's Jossie Bass is the publisher. Jossie Bass, JOSSEY-BASS, San Francisco. The date of this one is 1986. So again, you'd be able to find copies, but very useful stuff. Very useful stuff. And because he helps you design a kind of plan with the client based on their own discovery. I mean, your use of the whiteboard is very, very much needed at this point. I guess it doesn't have to be a whiteboard, but it's a very good way to illustrate the 6 or 5, divisions of conflict, and ask the client what they might know, what they think's going on. They always are able to respond. They know the conflict only too well. They wish they didn't know it so well. So they're in it. They're an expert on their conflict, that's for sure. They'll share. And if they can share in analysis, you're helping them objectivize and distance themselves from some of the painful parts, not for a generally therapeutic use, but to get them in a different position so they can get some traction on the conflict they've got. Jim Emerson asks, how do you choose an appropriate conflict theory for each case?
Yeah, I'll just jump in to clarify. What I meant was there's just a plethora of conflict theories, the pyramid theory, the circle of conflict. How do you sort of, mentally choose the right one? Do you have a favorite, or, yeah?
Jim, I would ask them. I'm a great one for asking. You regard the other person as the expert, and ask them and say, as you're speaking, Fred, it reminds me of something I've read. It reminds me of Christopher Moore. It reminds me that we might have a values conflict going. What do you think? And if he says, I'm not interested in that kind of stuff, that just bores me stupid, I don't want to go that direction, then, you've got it from him. Okay, well, we'll go some other way. That's the beauty of this kind of process, that you can go a different direction. It's not cut and dried, that you can only do one thing. You can ask the client, what do you think? And you generally would, through the session, ask them, how's this going? Are we wasting our time? Are you bored, rigid? And they'll tell you. And if they're bored, well, what'd be more interesting? Clearly I'm going down the wrong path with you. Let's back up and do something else.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So they'll tell you if the theory's got water in it. And just because I like a theory, I mean, you would get that, Jem, that it doesn't mean that that's going to go down well with the client.
That's right. Yeah. No, thank you. Appreciate that.
And I was going to say, through the course, you actually learn about when to use the theories as well.
Mm.
Thank you.
Yep, someone has been very helpful, Lara. Thank you. You've given a nice link to Chris Moore on Booktopia. I think, hadn't Booktopia gone into receivership? Apparently not. There it is, a link to the book. It won't be inexpensive, but it might be a good resource to buy.
They did go into receivership, but then they were bailed out.
Ah, okay. That's the ongoing. I thought, oh, well, I won't be doing any more business with Booktopia, but that's good to know if they're back in business. 2014, Lara says. Yes, thank you, Lara. So if you've got theory, don't think that I'm trying to edge you out. You know, if you've got a theory you like, I know that I had a colleague who very much like Cartman's triangle about victimhood. Really a lovely thing to illustrate for a client who maybe hasn't come across it, that there's the victim, the villain, and the rescuer. And many of our clients, particularly in family matters, have become rescuers or have become victims. Maybe they're villains, they're not going to tell you. And just to understand that there's already theory about that Cartman has been working on that and, you know, training in it and explaining it for decades, can be very reassuring, can be kind of buoying. As I said earlier, clients come into our room and our presence pretty new to this kind of stuff, just as we go into a dentist's not knowing a great deal about teeth, except that we've got 20 or 30 of them. So once they've met you, you're as informed in conflict as the dentist is in the subtleties of teeth, you know. So you can be awfully helpful to a client, and you can't do that in a conventional mediation. You know, it would just be awkward and embarrassing. And in fact, I didn't mention, but if you do conflict management for one, you generally would not be the mediator in the ensuing mediation if a mediation was to ensue. Someone else would do that. You wouldn't do both, because you've been in, even though you've kept all the skills and mindset of the mediator alive in the session, you're not, you're exposed to a great deal more private information and private feelings than is probably likely in the mediation itself. So, you know, as a rule of thumb, you wouldn't do both. Wow. Anyway, I love the fact that this morning's session has turned to theory. It sounds onerous and it sounds potentially boring, but it really can be wonderful for your clients that for the first time in their life, they actually are exposed to conflict theory. Why would they have read about it? I think no one that I've ever met arrives in the mediation room full of conflict theory. I might have met one or two mediators who knew one or two things about mediation, but on the whole, people don't know this stuff. And so by introducing it, I think you can open doors, and that's what we're always trying to do. My point is, if you open the door before mediation begins, how much better than discovering halfway through a mediation that your client is unprepared, is totally positional, and even without wishing to, is sabotaging their own process. I think we've all walked out of mediations really upset and disappointed that the client has sabotaged themselves, you know, and where to from here? Where to from here? You can only recommend they do CM1 after the mediation and perhaps catch up with you that way. It wouldn't be with you. It would be with a colleague who did conflict management. You don't want to have to explaining yourself in a mediation debrief. So I don't think you would do the CM1 as the mediator for that reason as well.
John, it's Jem again. Just one other question.
Yes, Jem.
How do you introduce this model into a mediation process if you're not the mediator? So do you get referrals? Do they pay extra for this? How does that work?
Yes. Generally, the client would be paying at the same rate for your service in CM1 as for mediation, which is like CM2.
Okay.
And a colleague would introduce you, or you would have met the client and then introduced them to a mediator.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. So,
Where I worked, Gem, which was in a Relationships Australia in Queensland, I had a natural referral network.
panel.
And so some of the colleagues here today are part of networks, some are solo mediators. If you're a solo mediator, the challenge might be to find a colleague who'll do CM1 and exchange the clients. You do CM1 one time, they do it the next time.
Yep, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
I've also added the website that's got more information about the CM1 as well, conflictmanagement.au. It's our new website, and we've got some mediators already on there. We're still looking for more mediators who want to do CM1 training and then provide it for clients.
The lovely thing about the Conflict Management for One website, which is conflictmanagement1word.au, click on and have a look at it after this session, is that for those people who've done the course, they can put themselves into a panel on that website and be available for clients. So they can do that via Zoom, over the phone, or face-to-face if they happen to be in the same vicinity as the client. I'm an old-fashioned guy. I like face-to-face, but I'm sure it can be done, and I'm assured by people now that they use Zoom all the time to do their conflict management for one sessions. But, you can become part of a panel, as Roanna says, and offer your service and try yourself out for conflict management for one. The great news is you can't get it wrong. You absolutely can't get it wrong, because if you stay alongside the client and remain, on message with them, the feedback is wonderful from conflict management for one clients. We did some research in the Relationships Australia days, and the results were extremely positive. No one said it was a waste of time. No one. And as I said at the outset of this, no one ran from the building upset, distressed, angry. No one. I mean, to have the undivided interest of a person like you is a wonderful thing. And the feedback is positive. It makes you feel good about it. It's a lovely thing to do. So I recommend it. But then again, I would say that no. We have to go. So lovely to see you, and thank you for your time, and might see you in the course.